For you guys that don't know, I don't know if you all know Brian, the maintenance man, but he's an old friend of mine. We met in 1989, so that's kind of why I'm here. But I got an art degree just like Brian did, so he fixes things, and I sell cheese with our art degrees. So art degrees lead many people down the culinary road. So I went to culinary school in '93 up in Oregon, and I don't know if you all know how lucky you are, but this facility is kind of blowing my mind. You're very, very lucky to have this and take full advantage of it. Shanna asked me to talk to you guys about some, like how I got into cheese and then some other opportunities in cheese. I was cooking professionally for years. The hours and the lifestyle were not working out for me. I wanted a more livable life. I wanted more of a daytime job instead of a nighttime job. I got tired of getting home at 2 a.m, stinking of fryer grease. So I transitioned from the kitchen into a deli. I set up a deli, built all the recipes, and unwittingly had to open a cheese and cured meat department. I knew next to nothing. I taught myself. This was the mid-'90s. It wasn't really a big thing yet. So I got a lot of books. I read everything I could get. And I learned a lot about cheese and cured meat, and I fell deeply in love with it. And I built a beautiful display. And someone saw my display, and he said, hey, come over to St. Louis, where Chef Paul's from, and build my counter in St. Louis. And he said, I want you to focus on American artisan cheese. And this was 1995. That was way ahead of the curve. This guy was asking for kind of the impossible. And it was great because it made me dive deep into little bitty American producers. And that's still my favorite focus today, is working with these little farms. Some of these farms have 20 cows, like real artisan and farmstead products. And when I'm saying words like farmstead, you guys all know what farmstead is? So farmstead means that the cheese is made on the farm from the milk of the animals on the farm. So you don't get any closer to the farm than a farmstead product. So I opened the deli, then I opened this cheese shop. I went from that to I did an internship in London at Neal's Yard Dairy, and I learned about aging cheese. I went from that into distribution, and I ran a couple $1 million a year cheese distribution center in Oregon. I went from that to owning my own shop for 16 years. And then I went from that to representing a small dairy in Vermont, where I did a lot of hands-on work. And that was during the pandemic, so we had to learn how to do everything very differently to survive. And now I work for Gourmet Imports for the past 2 years. And just to shamelessly sell myself, we come to Las Vegas one time a week, every Thursday. So when you all land in kitchens and you're looking for great products, hit me up. Also, my email address is there, sjones@gourmetimports.com. Any of you who want to see my product guide, or if you have questions or anything, email me. I'm happy to answer the questions. I mean, you don't have to buy anything from me. I like talking about cheese, so email me anytime. I'm happy to chat. But when you guys land in kitchens, if a couple of you ever want to become customers of mine, that'd be huge. So cheese. They're asking me to talk about building charcuterie boards. So I'm going to build 2 different charcuterie boards, maybe 3, but at least 2. One with the focus of if you were building a charcuterie board for, say, 2 or 4 people, and one for a charcuterie board for, more of a group. So a couple of rules with charcuterie boards. Odd numbers look better on plates. You guys have probably already learned that in a class. Odd numbers are just more appealing. So I love 3 to 5 cheeses is my favorite number for a plate. But if you're doing a bigger event, 7. Generally, I wouldn't go beyond 7 because you're just going to it gets lost. It becomes noise at some point. So for like a small one, sometimes 3 is the best way to go. If you're doing portions for individuals, my rule of thumb is I do 1 ounce portions, and each person will generally eat about 2 ounces of cheese. So if you're doing your math for how much cheese you need for your board, if you have 6 people, you're going to need about 12 ounces of cheese. So that's kind of a good, quick rule of thumb. It's about 2 ounces per person is generally what people will eat off of a board. And a 1 ounce portion with your scales, you'll be able to do this, but eventually you'll just be able to see that's pretty much a 1 ounce portion. I always say a Sharpie is about a 1 ounce portion. So if you imagine a Sharpie, that's about an ounce. So if I were doing this cheese board here for a charcuterie board for let's say it's 3 people. So I'm going to do 3 cheeses. This cheese that I'm cutting right now is a goat's milk Gouda from Southern Holland called Brabander. Everybody loves this cheese. People lose their minds over it. About the easiest cheese in the world to sell. Anybody who doesn't like goat, I beg them to try it because it's a pretty damn approachable goat. Gouda is, a great cheese for cheese boards. Everybody loves Gouda. It's fun to kind of surprise people and give them a different animal than cow. When you're building boards, you want to think about variety. So you want to think, if you do 3 cheeses, I usually do cow, goat, sheep. Anyone know what the 4th major dairy animal is? Cow, goat, sheep, water buffalo. So water buffalo mozzarella is the most famous one, but there's a number of water buffalo cheeses. So that's kind of a fun one to throw on a bigger board to surprise people. Water buffalo gives a really, really super high butterfat milk that makes for a really rich cheese. So if you guys haven't tried water buffalo cheese, try it. Probably the weirdest animal's cheese I've ever had, donkey, delicious. Yeah. You have to go to Italy to find it, but yeah, camel, not so good. Yak, not so good. So anyhow, those are 3 2-ounce portions or 3 1-ounce portions. So I'm going to do 3 cheeses for this board. So we've got the Brabander goat Gouda. Then I want to do a cow. A real classic is Comté. Comté is basically Gruyère's French cousin. So it's made in the same style. 80-pound wheel. Comté, do you guys know about origin control at all in Europe? So origin control is really cool. With a lot of these very traditional products, they have origin control that only allows you to use the milk from certain animals from a certain region, collected. You could only move it 16 kilometers. And then with Comté, the cool thing about Comté is that you have makers, that are called fermiers, that make the cheese. And then they have that green cheese, that young cheese that only sits in their facility for about 3 days. So this big 80-pound wheel that's still kind of floppy. Then a guy comes along and he picks it up. And this guy who picks it up is called an affineur. And the affineur is the guy who ages it. Affineur means to age. And so they take them to these huge facilities. Some of them hold up to 40,000 80-pound wheels of cheese. Just imagine, I got lost in one. It was so big. I was like, this is amazing. And the smell, you can't even imagine, So that affineur then ages it, and then they sell it off. And if you ask anybody in that part of France, if they milk a cow, if they make the cheese, or if they age the cheese, what they do, they all say, I make Comté. Even the guy who's milking the cow. Because it takes all 3 of them to make it happen, which I think is really cool and very un-American.
How long does it age?
Comté, so you can get it from 6 months up to 4 years. The sweet spot in my mind is 12 months to 14 months. And when you guys taste this Comté to me should always taste like tea with cream in it. It should be kind of not a big in your face. It's what I like to call moreish. You want to keep eating more of it. It's not something that you eat an ounce and you're like, that's enough. So the rind on this cheese is a natural rind. So that rind is developed. They wash this cheese with a brine solution. They wash it a couple times a week for the first few months, then 1 time a week for many, many months, and then eventually once every 2 to 3 weeks as it's aging. So that rind of this cheese, that's not anything that's rubbed on there or sprayed on there. That's just the outer edge of that cheese forming its natural rind. And they're doing that with that brine solution that they're literally physically rubbing that entire cheese. And imagine an 80-pound wheel, a slippery 80-pound wheel of cheese in a 58-degree cave. That's bananas, to be dealing with those. And actually, I'm going to backtrack to what I was going to talk about earlier. Careers in cheese. So there are so many different culinary careers in cheese, including being that guy in that cave who's flipping cheese. So if you like solitude and you like hard work, it's an endless job. It will never end. But like on dairies, for people, if somebody wants to leave the city and get out to the country, a lot of these dairies will give you housing and provide a place for you to live in the country, you know, in exchange for a poor wage, but a pretty amazing job. So if anybody ever wanted to explore an internship with a dairy, it's a pretty cool possibility for you. You know, then there's people like myself. I call myself a cheesemonger. Anybody who sells cheese to the public is a cheesemonger. And cheesemongers become like a real deal. Like in Whole Foods and everything, there's a certification program called the CCP, the Certified Professional Cheesemonger Certification, that is rigorous. It's more rigorous than a lot of professional doctor and dentist degrees. So it's become a real thing, and there's a decent wage tied to it. With distribution, there's people who do quality control. So if you have a very good palate, you can get paid to taste cheese as a living. So there are lots of cool different options within cheese. But most of you guys are going to be using it in a kitchen. So back to this. So Comté, natural rinded, raw milk, cow's cheese from France. Raw milk, anyone know what I'm saying with raw milk?
Pure milk coming from the cows, right from the cows.
Unpasteurized. So they're not heating it. So you guys know when you heat something up, you're changing the chemical components of it. You do the same thing when you heat up milk. You change the fatty acids, and you change what that milk is capable of becoming. So pasteurization is around because it's one way to protect people from foodborne illnesses. Raw milk cheeses in the United States have to be 60 plus days of age to be a raw milk cheese. So during that time, the pathogens and such, generally the good pathogens beat the bad pathogens and it becomes safe to eat. But raw milk cheeses are, I think, more delicious. There's more, it's like wine, and unfiltered wine quite often has a little more depth of flavor to it. So raw milk cheese is a fun, legal thing to use. The only thing is if somebody is like, if they ask you about raw milk cheese, generally the biggest concern is like listeria is a foodborne illness that causes illness and death. So mainly with pregnant women or people who are immune compromised, they generally want to avoid raw milk cheeses. But that's a whole nother ball of wax. So with this cheese, I'm going to cut 3 more 1 ounce portions. And we're going to talk about how this rind, you don't want to divide this up where you're giving somebody all the rind. You know, you want to think about how can I divide that rind as evenly as I can? Because I always say we all pay for the rind, you know. So you're always thinking, okay, how can I divide that rind up evenly? Well, I'm going to cut it down the middle. And now, you know, I can come along this way. I like to leave the rind on. It's a great point of reference. The flavor here compared to the flavor here will be different. So if you like thinking about what you're putting in your mouth, it's fun to taste from the center in towards the rind and see how things change. So portioning on this, I can, you know, come down this side like this. But once I get down here to this corner, I'm going to start wanting to do wedges instead. Hence dividing that rind evenly for everybody. So what you don't want to do is give somebody just that whole corner and then another person's got this teeny tiny bit of it. So you're always just trying to be as equal as you can with those portions. And then I've got a sheep. This is a sheep from France. It's fume something. Do you guys know what fume means? F-U-M-E. Fume means smoke or smoked. So this is a sheep's milk cheese that's been cold smoked with hardwood. So that rind, that color is coming from the smoke. The aroma, a lot of the flavor is coming from that smoke. So same deal. I want to divide this rind up evenly. So 3 is going to be a little difficult here. I mean, I can do it. So you have to do what I like to call cheese math. So We have 3 different animals. We only have 2 countries. If I had my entire toolkit, I would have, maybe 3 different countries. But 3 different animals, 2 different countries, 3 very different flavor profiles. And then if you have the room to go, into some additional cheeses, I would go with maybe a bloomy rinded cheese or a blue cheese or a wash-drained cheese. So wash-drained cheeses are the ones that smell real footy. It's a bacteria and yeast strain that's growing on that grows on your feet, that gives off that footy aroma. The French call that angel's feet. So bloomy rinded cheese, do you guys know what the rind of this cheese is? It's all mold, and it's a mold called Penicillium candidum. And so when they make this cheese in the liquid milk, when the milk is in the vat, they add this mold strain to the liquid dairy. And then when the cheese is aging, that mold will bloom. And so it only blooms where it's exposed to oxygen. So with the blue cheese, how that blue gets in the cheese is they poke the cheese with needles, and that gives the oxygen pathways into the cheese. And that's what allows the cheese to bloom and make that's Roquefortium penicillium is the mold strain in a blue cheese. So people will ask, should you eat the rind of cheese? With the bloomy rinded cheese, my answer is yes, but also you choose. Generally the bigger the wheel, the less likely you are to eat the cheese, because a really big 80-pound wheel has quite often been around for 14 months, 3 years. You're getting a lot of environment. You're tasting a lot of that cave. And also those really big wheels in Europe quite often are moved by rolling on the floor. So it's like the real big ones, I generally don't eat the rind. The smaller ones, I try a nibble. If I like it, I eat it. But it's all personal preference. But I always encourage people to try it. With the bloomy rind cheese, if you score the rind very gently, when you're cutting it, you're not going to push that rind through the cheese and crack the rind while you're cutting it. So that really loose little score right there will really help you out. If any of you really, really get into cheese, or if you're working at a restaurant with a really extensive cheese program, there's a device called a handy cutter, Handee, and it's a plastic rectangle with a wire spring-loaded base. So you're cutting it just with a very thin piece of wire, and you can cut everything from an 80-pound wheel of Parmesan to a 2-ounce croton using that device. If you only had one tool, that's the one that I would have, But if you're just in a kitchen that does cheese as, an ingredient or a few cheese plates, a chef's knife will work perfectly fine for you. So yeah, you can see in here, that mold is just on that surface. Now, if I let this sit in the walk-in for a couple weeks and you came back, that mold will have grown all the way across that cut face because it's all in there waiting to grow. So mold is just a natural part of cheese, It's one of the things that makes cheese cheese. So if you were portioning this, same deal. Just, try to think about that rind evenly. I'll go back and forth from one side to the other so I don't get all cattywampus. So on smaller boards, I like these 1-ounce portions are nice, mainly if it's like kind of a party situation. It's easier for people to just come and grab as they want. But when I'm serving cheese to people, I really want to put out portions. I want to put out a nice size piece of cheese because it really lets the cheese kind of express itself better. And then, put some knives out and let people whack away with it. One part of that, though, is what I like to, with this guy, now I like having that rind on there, but if I were to put a big piece out here, I'm going to go ahead and cut off that one piece of rind. Put it out like that. Just to be really, really geeky, because that's what I'm here for. Cheese etiquette. When you're eating cheese in this situation, people quite often make the mistake that they start cutting like this. Well, what are we going to get to? We're going to get to all rind. So what you want to try to do is go, one side, then the other side, and then, eventually you're going to go more like this. But you don't want to just have it all end up being, the last 8 people are getting all rind and the first 12 people are getting all paste. So just kind of always think about how are you leaving that rind for the next people. And also when you're cutting cheese, I always say it's kind of like playing chess. You have to think about the next 2 moves beyond you. So the piece you're cutting, you have to imagine, what am I leaving the chef behind me to work with? So if I take this great piece of cheese, and I've got this perfect piece of cheese, and then I leave the chef this garbage piece of cheese where he's working with like that, that's not cool. So you have to always think like, what am I cutting right now? What am I leaving for the next person to use? And then also, this is just kind of a fun little teachable moment. Most of the paper that cheese comes in is intentionally made for cheese to be able to live in. So this has got this outer plastic has got a little micro perforation, and then there's a little kind of thin paper on the inside here. So when you're storing this piece of cheese, Chef Paul's going to come back to this next week. He's got what he needs for the week. Put a little piece of cellophane right on that cut edge, just a teeny bit, just covering that cut edge, but then drop it back in this paper. And if you just do a little pleated fold like this, it'll keep it closed. Then tape up your ends. But that piece of cheese in your walk-in for 10 days, 2 weeks is going to be way happier than that piece of cheese in cellophane. Because cellophane's it's a living thing, and cellophane will suffocate it. So when you can reuse your cheese paper, if it's not dirty, your cheese paper is going to keep your cheese happiest. Also, in why am I thinking? What is the name? Cambros, like a rectangular or square container with a locking lid. Keep all your different cheeses in a Cambro, because you're going to keep your humidity up. Mainly someplace like Las Vegas, where it's a desert, it wants to dry stuff out. So anything that'll help keep your humidity higher is going to make your cheese happier. So cheese storage is almost as important as how you use it. So let's see. Another thing to consider, so you've got your animals, you've got your textures, you've got your styles. Color. I mean, your eye eats first, so adding some color to a board is always a great move. If you do everything like just all white, it is the most boring looking board on the planet. So when you've got something with a nice flash of color, get some color on there.
What cheese is that?
This cheese is called Mimolette. Mimolette it's another origin controlled cheese from France. The color in this very bright orange color comes from annatto seed. So annatto is a natural dye. And that's where that color comes from. It's essentially flavorless. Unless you're really, really attuned, it's pretty much flavorless. The rind on Mimolette, this one only has a few of them. Let's see. Here, pass that around. So see those divots in this rind, you guys? When that's going around, there's these divots in this rind. And those are formed by mites, cheese mites. And it affects the flavor of the cheese, these mites that are actually living on the cheese. And so when you open up Mimolette and there's a like powdery substance, those are dead mites. So just for fun.
It's just extra protein.
Yeah.
That's right, so.
But it's a very intentional part of like the aging process for this cheese. They just have good taste, those mites.
Could they still be out there right now?
If you're an electron microscope, there would still be a few probably. But that was under cryovac, so they're probably dead.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think we're getting some nice color on this one, some nice textural difference. So we're going to finish this up with a piece of blue. I don't know. It's kind of like, who's the first person to have ate an oyster? I'm like, that slimy, weird-looking thing, you're going to eat that? So I like most culinary things, I think it happy accidents.
Okay.
You know, was how a lot of things started. And, you know, people were like, what's that?
Trying to figure out how to preserve that.
Well, I was going to say, that's the next thing is all cheese is fermented. So you guys know, like, the easy way to store products without refrigeration, fermentation is one of the main things. So all fermented foods have a much longer shelf life. Your cured meat, same deal. It's fermented. You're just changing the water activity and making it a more stable product. Same with, you know, sauerkraut and fermented pickles and all those things. So,
how do we know which mushrooms are edible and which are poisonous?
feed them to your friend and take notes. There's kind of two different ways to approach charcuterie. You know, the more the individual portions, the more the larger portions. And like I said before, you know, 2 ounces per person. This is about this is a little under a half pound, so this is probably 6 ounces. So that's 3 people's worth of brie, basically. But you do that number combined across the entire thing. So let's just say this is 6 ounces, 6 ounces, 6 ounces. So 5 times 6, that's 30 ounces of cheese here, almost 2 pounds of cheese. So that should serve 16 people with that 2 ounces. And that, when you look at that, you're kind of like, yeah, that would be, you know, that'd be wiped out by 16 people. Because the goal is you want to give them enough to eat, but not like have half your cheese left over either. So, and then with your boards, I'm a big proponent of, I like to put the edible, the tip out towards the end. You see people build boards facing inward, and I feel like that's like, you know, a group of people talking and not allowing you in. You know, you want the cheese to welcome you. So if you put the cheese facing out, I think it's easier for people to get into it, you know. And then with the cured meat aspect, prosciutto is great. Like Paul was saying, tomorrow when he's teaching the slicer class, we're going to talk about thinner prosciutto. But, you know, prosciutto is really nice because you can put a few pieces in and cover a lot of space. A lot of like a really nice charcuterie board is trickery. You want it to look very, very full without, you know, blowing your margin. Because cheese is not great margin, you know, so you have to be careful. It's a bad margin ingredient. So you have to figure out how to stretch it out and make it look nice. Cured meat, obviously a classic part of a cheese board. So you can cover a lot of space with a little meat, mainly the thinner you slice the meat. I quite often will think of, when I'm placing the meat, I'm like, what is that meat going to taste best with? Like this smoked sheep is going to go really nice with this calabrese, so I'm going to make sure and put that calabrese right beside it, hoping that people might, you know, think, oh, I'm going to try those together. But yeah, you're filling space. You can also, with your cured meat, do a little quick, you know, half roll, and that gives you a lot more depth, you know, real easily, real quickly. You can do fancy rosettes. I mean, there's like ways to make beautiful, like look like roses, basically. But yeah, cheese boards are a really fun way to utilize cheese. I think they're great in a catering program. You know, it's just, everyone loves to attack a cheese board. So nuts go really, really nicely with blue cheese. So I always put nuts beside blue cheese. If you have a drizzle of honey right across those nuts, blue cheese, honey, and nuts, classic combination. You know, the pickles of different varieties right with the cured meats, amazing. Who doesn't want to have that? Other things that are really, really fun to consider with a charcuterie board is kind of get crazy and get out there and be like, okay, what else might work? Dark chocolate with Conte, fantastic. I've seen people do things as crazy as Pop Rocks, you know, the candy. Like candy and cheese boards are becoming like every Halloween now people are doing candy and cheese boards. And there's some pretty fun combinations. Fresh fruit, fantastic. You know, pickles are great. I had a place that it was It's was basically an izakaya for cheese, and there was the menu was 30 cheeses that you could click off as many as you wanted, just like when you get sushi. And then we did a lot of really fun ingredients, like we used dried seaweed and lots of cool Asian ingredients that worked really, really well. And those were super fun, and those kind of blew people's minds. Like dried seaweed on a bloomy rinded cheese looks really cool. And then you try it, and it's like, you know, it's got this natural umami booster. So cheese has got a lot of umami anyhow, so you can, you can look at it a number of different ways. You can try to match a flavor, comparative. You can try to go against a flavor, contrasting. So sometimes like blue cheese and honey, they're very different, but that's why they work. But like the dried seaweed and the bloomy rind cheese, very, very similar. And then the other one that always works really nicely is regional. So what grows together goes together. So if you've got a cheese from like the French Pyrenees make these great sheep's milk cheeses, and they also make this great tart cherry jam that's a very regional product. And those two together are just a slam dunk. Oregon grows great hazelnuts. So we serve hazelnuts with our cheese up there quite often because they really, really work out nicely together. So get creative. There's no no's to this. It's just figure out what is your yeses more. That is my basics of cheese board making. So I'm a little ahead of schedule, but I'm going to open it up, and I hope we can burn half an hour. Yes, Chef Dan.
Can you explain how cheese is made?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. It's funny. Oh, this blue cheese, by the way, is Maytag Blue, made in Newton, Iowa, 27 miles from where I grew up. And my dad was a herdsman there in the 40s. And that was just happenstance that's what Chef Paul gave me. So that's really cool. So my dad took care of the cows at this place 80 years ago, which I think is kind of like, woo! How is cheese made? So it's really basic. The cool thing about cheese is it all starts out the same way. And then you can go a million different ways. I call it choose your own adventure. You take a vat of some size. Most cheese making vats, you'll see them as large. You could swim in them, literally. They get like a lap pool. They're so big. But so anywhere from, a large kettle to 1,500 gallons. You start with the liquid dairy in the vat. Then you add your coagulant. And your coagulant, what it does is it makes the milk break. So you don't want to break sauces, but you do want to break milk. So you're making that milk break. And when you make that milk break, it becomes what's known as curds and whey. And so you generally at that point, you're going to drain off the whey. Varying degrees of draining the whey on what you want. The firmer the cheese, the more of that whey you're going to drain off. The firmer the cheese, the smaller you're going to cut the curd. So they use these big harps, they're called. They're basically this big, and they're a whole bunch of wires that they're pulling through until you're cutting. Like cheddar curds are like this big, about as big as your thumb. The curds for Comté are rice-sized. So, you'll cut all the way down to rice kernel. And when you're doing that, you're affecting how much whey you can get out and how firmly you can press that cheese, because those are some of the steps that are coming up. Or like, if you leave more whey in, you get a more acidic flavor. You get a higher moisture cheese with maybe a little more spring. You can also at that point cook the curds. If you cook the curds, it gives them a more springy curd. You can also stretch the curds. So what's called pasta filata is the stretch curd cheeses. So mozzarella, provolone, Oaxacan cheese are all stretch curd cheeses. And when you're doing that, you're literally changing the molecular structure of that curd. And you get a cheese that melts and gives you that good pull and a melt. Where like Parmesan, never will do that because Parmesan's cut down to rice size. So it's never going to give you that pull. So draining, cutting, packing into hoops. You can there's also culture added. So you're adding the rennet to make it break. You're adding culture, and culture gives you your flavor profiles that you're looking for. So sweeter, more tangy, Your cultures are going in there to develop flavor. And then from that point, they're generally going to go into hoops. The hoops are sometimes pressed, sometimes not pressed, sometimes pressed under a great deal of pressure. And then they'll usually sit in the hoop for anywhere between an hour to a couple of days, depending on the cheese. Then out of the hoop, sometimes there's salt in that milk. So if there's no salt in that milk, that cheese is generally dropped into a gigantic brine bath. Once again, sometimes like a lap pool size brine bath of cheese that they then float in that brine bath. Like Parmesan is in a brine bath for 3 to 6 days. And that's all the salt is coming to that cheese through that brine bath. So, some people are literally adding the salt into the milk. Some people are salting the curds, and some people are adding the salt in the brine bath. So salting is, if you make cheese without salt, it's terrible. It's very boring. And then from there, it's mainly like, do you want to, do rind development? Do you want to, develop a rind? If you do, you're going to probably wash them or brush them and develop that rind. The smoking, developing rinds. And so in my mind, the time in the vat is essential, but the real fun stuff happens in that other 7/8 of the life of the cheese. That time in that cellar affects flavor way more than the time in the vat, really, ultimately. So that's why I find cheese super fascinating, because it's like you can really it's like the mother sauces. You take a mother sauce, you can go a million different ways. Once you got your mother sauces, run with it. So that's basically how you make cheese, yes.
What's the nastiest cheese you've ever tasted?
There's one in Italy.
Nasty good. But
Yeah. Nasty bad in my mind. There's one that you guys have maybe seen videos of in Italy where they encourage maggots to actually grow in the cheese. Yeah. I regrettingly had a taste of that. It was terrible. Yes.
Can you please explain to everybody what culture is?
Culture's hard. I mean, because cultures can be a bunch of different things. They're generally, they're quite often like yeast and bacteria, things that affect how flavor develops in cheese. It's the part of cheese making I understand the least. It's kind of a culture. Salespeople are very secretive about their cultures. You can also develop your own cultures. So the problem with developing your own cultures is it's really hard for consistency. So you can take some of your milk from the previous day's make and hold it aside, and basically like you're making creme fraiche, let that, kind of sour a bit, and then that can be your culture. But to control that is much harder. So culture is kind of almost like sourdough, where you've got that,
But the cultures in cheese, is that also the same as like when they're making cultured butter, pretty much?
Same idea, because cultured butter, you're letting
Bacteria.
Yeah, I mean, what's in this room
Yeah.
is natural cultures, but these guys create these cultures in laboratories, and they're very controlled. And I mean, a lot of these people like Tillamook, they want super consistent product. Their QC person is looking for the same flavor day after day after day after day. Where an artisan maker like Parish Hill out in Vermont that makes their own cultures, they embrace the seasonality of it. And they're like, they want you to have a different cheese every time. They want you to realize it's handmade and it's farmstead and it's, all the things. So it's kind of, if you're in a gigantic hotel, you don't want that variance. But if you're in a little bistro, it's a fun thing to talk about. So
A lot of cheese aging rooms are open.
yeah.
Farms, doors open.
Yeah, I mean, not as much as it used to be, but yeah, in Europe it used to be quite a bit. Now the FDA has really cracked down on that, and so it's not nearly as much as it used to be. But the flora in a cave, a lot of these are a tractor trailer that they've converted to a cave, but a controlled environment where you're aging the cheese in, that fauna that you're growing in there it takes a while. And like if you have to change caves, they try to inoculate and get that similar culture built back up in the cave, because it's like when you see a cheesemaker who has to clear a cave and go to a different cave, quite often it's 6 or 8 months until they return to where they want their product to be, because that natural culture is really a big part of it.
how do you know, can you compare the cheeses with certain crackers to give it its best? Is it al dente?
Yeah. So, I mean, my thought on crackers or any vehicle that you're going to put the cheese with, like, I'm a purist. I loved it. Like, people are like, what are you going to do with this? I'm going to put it in my mouth and eat it, you know. But generally, my next step beyond that is a good baguette is my first choice, just because I love a good baguette. But beyond that, I generally go with as neutral a cracker as I can. So a nice little, you know, sheet cracker of some kind is great. But then sometimes with like blue cheese, they love like something with some whole wheat or even some raisins or dates or something. So you kind of almost have to think about the cheese and be like, what would that cheese like? A lot of English cheeses like more of a brown bread cracker. Amazingly, fruitcake with like English cheeses is fantastic, like a really good fruitcake. And then there's also, do you guys know like pan forte? So pan forte forte means strong. So it's a strong bread, but it's basically usually predominantly nuts and fruits. So those are really, really good with cheese quite often. Does that answer your question or no? Okay, sorry. Yes?
Is there a difference in flavor between a grass-fed cow and just a regular?
Big time, yeah. So cows on pasture, there's no right or wrong. You know, some people are like, oh, I only use pasture raised. For cheese making, quite often pasture raised is not great because the variance is so wide. So if you're looking for that super consistency, pasture raised is sometimes not the right answer. But for like the smaller artisan guys, it's fantastic because it's super expressive. Like Conte, that's a big part of what makes Conte is the milk. They're at a high altitude in the Jura, which is over by the Swiss Alps. So those cows are up on high pasture. They're doing, do you guys know what the word transhumance means? So transhumance is where you take your animals from down in the valley and you slowly work them up the mountain. So you're keeping them on fresh grass as long as you can and then back down the mountain in the fall. So you'll be in like the Jura or Switzerland, and you'll see like way up on these mountains, these little dots, and it's like, oh, those are the cows because they've worked them way up the mountain. And so they're on that fresh green grass for a longer period of time. And that really green grass high in keratin, you get a much more yellow color. You'll see it seasonally. The same cheese by the end of August will be almost as pale as that. Because that's why that is that color, is that keratin coming through from the grass. So yes, the grass affects the flavor a lot. The other thing with cows on grass is next to nowhere has grass year round. So when the cows come onto grass and off of grass, their gut is not great for cheese making for a couple weeks because they've gone off of silage, so dry rations to green grass. So you have like bad cheese making for a couple weeks at the beginning of the season, and then when they're going back onto silage, the same thing. So that's probably more information than you needed on that. But ultimately, I mean, there's a lot of sexiness to cows on pasture. You know, it's also very good for sequestering carbon. Hooved animals outside is a environmentally good thing. So that's, you know, a great story to be able to tell because people always want to crap on cheese, and it's like, oh, I mean, bison were all over America for hundreds of thousands of years, you know. So yeah, there's lots of good to the pasture story. Yes?
So the longer the aging process, it's less lactose?
Yes. So if you have somebody who wants to avoid lactose, getting out past 60 days, that lactose almost disappears. And also for people who have a hard time digesting dairy, a lot of people, goat and sheep are a lot easier to digest than cow. So if they want a fresher cheese, quite often they can do those.
I can add to that. The reason is most people that can have, like I can't have cows, but I can have sheep's and cheese, is sheep's milk and goat's milk, the molecule is closer to human milk. So it's easier to digest. And your body's more familiar with
Right.
cows, and cows
Right.
is so much harder to digest.
Yeah,
than,
it's got a lot longer fatty acid chain, and our guts aren't really set up for it. Yeah, there's a gigantic swath of the population that cow's milk does not work for them. Yes.
How do you get the cheese to get light?
I'm sorry?
How do you get the cheese get so light? It's the hard.
So hard? It's just the moisture dropping out of it. So this cheese that when I buy it, it's a 20-pound wheel, but when it goes into that cellar, it's a 30-pound wheel. So while it's in that cellar, that moisture is slowly evaporating and it's concentrating flavor, but you lose a lot of weight in the cellar on these aged cheeses. Yes.
How long would that typically take? Does it vary from the cheese?
Yeah, I mean, it also varies on the form. So like something really big takes a lot longer. Something small can drop weight really fast. So like the smaller guys, they have to really keep an eye on them because they'll just, But yeah, it's amazing. Like the loss is huge. It's.
Would you have any tips for someone just starting to build charcuterie boards? Like, how do you place it on there? Is there like...
I mean, the main things are, like I said, consider texture, consider the animals, consider the styles, and then consider just the appearance. Like this one, I think is like more for the eye because it's got a lot of different, texture and color variants. Does that answer your question? Or I'm sorry. Yeah, that's the main one. It's just like try to think about those variables and try to include as many of them as you can every time.
I think one of the main things that you said earlier was cows milk, cheese, goats, and sheep have a variety. Some people just put all cow's milk on it.
Yeah.
And they make it with just a creamy piece of goat cheese. Like, no, there are so many good goat
Yeah.
and sheep cheese out there.
Yeah.
Get the variety.
Yeah.
It really gets the flavor because cows and goats and cheese flavor profiles are all
Yeah.
way different.
And if you don't have the choice of getting cows, goats, sheep, and you're going with cows, make sure that you do a soft, a hard, a medium.
Yeah. Try to get a brie, a cheddar, and a blue, but just try to, yeah. Yes.
One more question. So, as far as like, can you compare the cheeses with wines? Which wines and cheeses go together in combination, bring out the best flavor?
So, my book is in your guys' library, so check out my book.
Yeah, there you go.
Brian donated my book. So. Yeah. I've made $0 on my book so far, so don't write a book to make money. Do it as a passion project.
There's also been studies lately that show that beer and cheese is a better pairing than wine and cheese.
I agree with that personally. But with wine, I mean, my quick rules are regional. It will almost always be best. So if you've got a French cheese or a French wine from, say, the Burgundy region, Jura is right next door to that region, so the Comté. So Comté goes really good with French Pinot Noir, and Comté goes great with Pinot Noir, period. Brabander, you want to talk about a cheater? Just go with Brabander. That thing works with everything. That's like the easiest cheese in the world to pair with beverages, like everything. What?
Bubbles.
Yeah. Bubbles, yeah. Yeah, bubbles are great because bubbles keep your palate fresh because of the effervescence, so you can taste, like, dark red wine is the hardest.
Yeah.
Because your palate's dead after 3 or 4 sips. Where with sparkling wine, you can keep going, and sparkling wine with a bloomy rind, like a triple creme or a fresh goat, yeah. But yeah, the regional thing is kind of your cheater, and then finding a cheese like Brabander. I have a couple of those that I just lean on. There's a cheese called Asso Arati from the French Pyrenees that is very flexible. Comté is very flexible.
All right. Did everybody learn something today?
Yes.
Why don't we give Steve a hand for his fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah. Those were great questions.
I was just telling Brian, we need to have him come back every year. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for coming out.
Yeah,
and
my
spending
pleasure.
your time today. Give us